I never thought that I'd be stuck, reacting in such a way to the news and to uh, critical pieces and to people's appraisal of fiction, but here we are. I don't think that I have to react at all. Obviously, I could just choose to ignore it, but I had an old English teacher growing up and going up to the high school system that forced us to read uh, an interesting pair of books, but The Crucible, The Scarlet Letter, and Romeo and Juliet. And that brings me into some of my more recent frustrations, which you know, um, Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey. Were super popular pieces of trash romance that managed to grip a very wide audience. And 50 Shades of Grey is more like 50 Shades of Abuse. The problem with these two is that they tend to glorify an abusive relationship, but then going back to it, we also have Wuthering Heights, which is written about in, oh god, like people at the Atlantic are writing about this, and major American publications. And I'm stuck basically coming on here and pointing out this is a book that's a romance in the classical sense. And that word classical might as well be a synonym of tragedy. And a world in which you'd be better off just not living in the first place. This is about ruinous love. It's about Wuthering Heights is a book that has only like just absolutely horrible people in it and doesn't present any of its characters with a very redeeming personality at all. Both man and woman are just awful people. And like Wuthering Heights is just a trashy, terrible book. And if it does technically qualify as a romance, but it qualifies as a romance in the same way that Romeo and Juliet qualifies as a romance. And like the thing about romances from that era and in the classical era, in the classical sense of the term, is that classical writers seem to be far more convinced and determined to convince us that romance will only end in tragedy, and that all of this about the way that romance functions is only going to meet like a very tragic end, and is a terrible, awful thing. And Romeo and Juliet kind of fails in a lot of ways, because obviously the two of them end up dead in the end. They come from families that hate each other. And Juliet is convinced Romeo has killed himself. And yeah, this is just a terrible, terrible, terrible book. And this is what they threw on us. And what Shakespeare threw on us. And you can say he was a great writer if you want, but I don't think that this was among his best writing, to say the least, about Romeo and Juliet. And when I look back on all of it, I hate all three of Wuthering Heights, Wuthering Heights, Twilight, and 50 Shades of Abuse. I hate all three of them in a big way. They're really just terrible books. And it left me feeling like I'm stuck running apologetics for anime romance, because it was just like, why is it precisely that you've fled your own culture and began to explore Japanese culture and anime romance as opposed to like romantic fiction, and then it hits, you know, it hits in a big way, which is just like Wuthering Heights is a romance, but it's not really a great love story at the end of the day, and the same could be said of Twilight and 50 Shades of Abuse. These are trying like really hard to be romances, but all three of them just achieve the effect, the net effect of basically glorifying an abusive relationship. feat for which I'm afraid to say this, but the world would be better off if it just burnt every single copy of all three of them and forgot they ever existed. And frankly, that they had never been written. If we just lost it and zero filled all the digital copies too, and just permanently purged that data, I don't think the world would be suffering a big loss to lose all three of them. Really, I mean, the world is just would be in a better place without them. Um, Honestly, and I find myself feeling this like I don't know. I mean, after having established such a backstory myself of having a degree of emotional masochism myself that enabled me to fall in love with Rumbling Hearts as much as I did, because that series that show is a love story, but it's a love story that just clobbers you over the head and hurts. But it doesn't hurt in the same way that Seikano would, clobbers you over the head and hurts. It's a lot more of a slow burn type of pain that I find really really enjoyable with Rumbling Hearts. Seikano just clobbers you over the head, and it's like might as well get it out of the way right away, and then just it's just depressing from like start to finish. But when I'm at least aware of it, but anime romances tend to have an advantage over the classic, and that you know man, boy, girl end up together, and they don't always end up. It doesn't always end up in a tragedy. So, I mean, I think that this combined with the fact that it being a very different society than here in the West, where to be honest with you, Japan can be sort of cold and unfriendly. So you have a culture where a lot of the romantic fiction ends up being one in which the girl likes the guy just because he's nice and considerate, because that actually makes him stand out from the crowd, so to speak, from the rest of the culture that they're a part of. It's the complete opposite of what you see here in the West, where it's like, often the guy gets picked just because he's a prick who's emotionally abusive and doesn't behave like the guys that you know um will basically defend everything that she does and puts him through and never gives her any pushback. Like, spinelessness is seen as a repulsive trait here in the West by women. Whereas, apparently in Japan men have too much of a spine. you know it's the complete and polar opposite, sort of cultures. And it's like, unfortunately, like, I don't like my own society for this particular aspect of it. I mean, I'm not, I guess with women, the kind of person that never ever ever gives any pushback and doesn't have a spine. But unless there's a need to push back, I tend to believe in kindness. And there usually isn't. But if they give me shit that is completely unacceptable and violates my boundaries, I always push back. It's not a big deal. But yeah, I think because I'm not afraid of them really. It's not like I'm afraid they're going to kick the shit out of me. So with with these romances in the classical sense, like, I've got somebody that's willing to come on here on YouTube and say that Wuthering Hearts is yes, it's a romance, and I'm just like sitting there like, yeah, like in the same sense that these Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey are a romance. Like, sure, there's the classical sense where everything ends in tragedy, and often all the characters are terrible people. But yeah, if that's what you want to go with, then yeah, sure, we can call it a romance. But the problem with that is that it's a pile of shit, you know. So yes, Wuthering Heights is a romance, but if you were looking for a love story, you're going to fucking hate it with good reason. And you know, the thing, there are other people who have come on here and said that they love it just out of a sense of love of the macabre and horrifying, and I'm like, that's definitely a way to look at it, and if you go into it with that sense, I guess you could come out the other side enjoying the experience. But for me, it was, if I have no interest in doing that. I'm not, despite my own gothic tendency, it's just like, nah. I think I'll pass on seeing this kind of suffering enter the romantic realm. It's like, we are often drawn, I guess, to macabre things, and it's not a big deal in the gothic world and community. It's like almost expected. But the thing is this, but I think that tragic romances are something to fucking avoid, really, at the end of the day. I don't like them ultimately. And this sense that the romantic realm has been wed to tragedy for as long as it is in of itself a tragedy that is completely unnecessary. Like, a love story need not end in tragedy. It need not be tragic. This is not a prerequisite for any of it, and I'm getting fucking sick of it. So, as an apologetic for anime romances, what does anime lord over romance that we've seen too much of in the world of literary fiction? Um, Honestly, a lot of anime romances are not actually tragedies. They're not wed to tragedy in the same way that the world of literary fiction and romance has been in the class, at least in the most classical sense of romance. Classical romance sucks.